The second impossible report reached Candlekeep before dawn. I had not slept. My eyes were still tracing the 4 words from the previous dispatch. Bane is dead, over and over, as though repetition might wear down the impossibility the way water wears down stone. The new courier was younger than the first. His hands were shaking so badly that he dropped the letter twice before I could take it from him. Torm had died, the loyal fury, the god who had stood against Bane before the gates of Tantras, the god whose courage had been the city's only shield, had fallen in the same battle that claimed the Black Lord. For several hours, the letter said, Tantras had no god. Only ash and silence and the slowly dawning horror that the price of Bane's death had been the death of their protector. I set the letter down. I had no words. What words exist for the moment you realize that even victory is just another kind of loss? Then, before the ink on the first letters had dried, and I am being literal, not poetic. The ink was still wet. The courier had ridden through the night to reach us. New messengers arrived. Torm lived. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, not in the hearts of the faithful. Lived, walked, breathed, stood in the central square of Tantras, while the surviving citizens wept and touched his scarred armor to prove to themselves that he was real. I set that letter beside the first one and stared at both until the candle burned out. The survivors of Tantras agreed on one truth, and only one. Torm had stood against Bane before the city's walls, and neither had yielded. The battle between them had been something that language could not capture. Every witness who tried to describe it eventually fell silent, their sentences trailing into gestures, their gestures dissolving into helpless shrugs. "You would have had to be there," one soldier wrote, "and I was there, and I still cannot tell you what I saw." When the battle ended, when the light subsided and the pressure released and the world became the world again, both divine bodies lay broken upon the earth. Bane was dead. Torm was dead. And for several hours, the war between gods had claimed both its combatants. Then the testimonies diverged. Not gradually, not ambiguously. They split down the middle like a page torn in half. On one side, witnesses who described a voice descending from the heavens without thunder. Not the voice of Torm, not the voice of any god they recognized, but a voice that seemed to speak directly into the structure of reality itself. On the other side, witnesses who remembered only light, blinding radiance washing across the battlefield, erasing shadows, erasing doubt, erasing the boundary between the mortal world and whatever lay beyond it. The voice and the light described the same event from different angles. A judgment, a reversal, a declaration that the sacrifice of the loyal fury, a god who had given his life in defense of a mortal city, who had honored his duty to the absolute limit of what duty could demand, had been weighed on a scale that no mortal could see and found sufficient. More than sufficient. Worthy. A priest who survived the battle wrote only one sentence on an otherwise blank pool before sealing his letter. Ao judged Torm differently. He offered no explanation, no argument, no theological framework. Only those 4 words, written with a steadier hand than the rest of his account. as though the terror of the battle had shaken everything else loose. But this one truth had settled into him like stone into earth. Permanent, immovable, beyond the need for justification. Ao judged Torm differently. Different from Bane, the tyrant who had sought to conquer, who had looked at the crisis of the gods and seen opportunity for domination. Different from the other fallen deities, whose names were beginning to appear in frightened whispers across Faerun. Different, perhaps, from every expectation that the gods themselves had held about the nature of their punishment. The Overgod, who had cast them all down, had just made an exception. I returned to every page I had written since this chronicle began. Maestra's death on the celestial stair, Helm's blade passing through her chest, the weave screaming across every corner of Faerun. Silent temples, wandering gods, the siege of Shadowdale, the road to Tantras, Bane's body lying broken before the walls. Each event had followed a harsh but discernible logic. The gods were mortal now, and mortals could die. But Torm's return shattered that logic as completely as Bane's fall had established it. One death had broken the rules. One resurrection had rewritten them. Was this mercy? A reward for unwavering duty, for a god who in the moment of ultimate testing had chosen sacrifice over survival, protection over power? Or was it something more dangerous? Something that had less to do with Torm's worthiness and more to do with the rules of the game being rewritten in the middle of play. Because if Ao could restore one fallen god, then the punishment was never absolute. The exile was never permanent. The mortality was never final. And every god still walking Faerun, Tyr on the trade way, Timora in the gambling halls, Sune weeping in her ruined garden, now knew that their fate was not fixed. Their death was not guaranteed. Their survival was not impossible. But also, and this is the darker side of the same revelation, their restoration was not guaranteed either. Ao had judged Torm differently. That meant every god would be judged individually, not by a single rule applied equally to all, but by a standard that might shift depending on what they did in this mortal form, this vulnerable flesh, this brief and terrible window of reduced divinity. The time of troubles was not merely a punishment, it was a test, and Torm had just become the first god to pass. I searched every shelf in Candlekeep for precedent. There was none. The resurrection of a god, not a mortal, not a hero, not a saint, but a genuine deity whose divine essence had been severed from its mortal vessel, was an event that had never been recorded in any archive, in any language, in any era of Faerun's history. I was holding the first account, the only account. And I did not know whether to file it under miracle or precedent, or something else entirely. Some new category that would need to be invented to contain what had just happened. Tonight, I record two impossible truths beside one another, without crossing either out. Torm died fulfilling his duty, the highest duty, the ultimate duty, the duty that had defined his existence since before mortal memory began. Torm lives because Ao willed it, because the Overgod looked at the loyal Fury's sacrifice and decided that some deaths deserve to be reversed. Between those two sentences lies a mystery greater than any battle I have documented, and a hope more terrifying than any threat I have chronicled. Because if death is not final, then nothing is. And if nothing is final, then everything is still being decided.
The Impossible Archive is open. New episodes every week. Subscribe before the next entry disappears.